The wind came sharp as a blade across the Wyoming Territory prairie, driving snow crystals horizontal through the gray afternoon of early April 1876. Josephine Kessler knelt in the frozen mud outside Harmon's trading post. Her body curved protectively around the bundle pressed against her chest. Inside the ragged wool blanket, 6-month-old Clara wheezed with each shallow breath, her tiny lips edged the color of bruised plums. Josephine's knees had long since gone numb, soaked through where the ice-crusted puddles had melted under her body heat. Her fingers, bare because she had soled her gloves 3 weeks prior, were white at the tips, the nails blue. She did not feel the cold anymore. She felt only the terror of Clara's labored breathing. The knowledge that her daughter, because that was what Clara was now, regardless of how she had come into Josephine's life, was starving. "Please," she whispered, though her voice was lost in the howl of wind. Her German accent, usually softened by 3 years in America, thickened with desperation. "I can work. I can keep books. I can mend. I can cook. I can—" The words caught in her throat, tangled with the offers she knew desperate frontier widows made when their children were dying. The kind of offer that bought milk and flour and meant you could never look at yourself in a mirror again without seeing shame. The trading post door remained shut. Through the frost-rimed window she could see Harmon's thick silhouette behind the counter, his back deliberately turned. She had already tried there twice today, and yesterday, and the day before. Her husband Heinrich's death in the Red Willow mine collapse 3 months earlier had left her with $17 in debts and a reputation as the widow of a man who had cut corners and gotten 6 miners killed alongside himself. Sympathy was a luxury Sorrow Hill could not afford. A shadow fell across the snow, cutting through the pale afternoon light. Josephine looked up slowly, her vision swimming from cold and hunger. The man standing over her was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps in his late 30s, wearing buckskin leggings and a heavy buffalo robe that made him seem even larger. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with deep-set eyes the color of coffee, and a jagged scar running from his left temple down through his cheekbone to his jaw, the kind of mark a rifle bullet leaves when it grazes instead of kills. His black hair was braided in 2 plaits, bound with strips of red cloth. Josephine had seen him before 3 or 4 times over the winter trading furs at Harmon's. Lakota, she had heard whispered. Mini Kanju band. The townspeople gave him wide berth, their glances edged with the particular mixture of fear and resentment that had thickened since news of the northern troubles began filtering down through the territory. General Crook's expedition, rumors of a great gathering of tribes near the Powder River, stories of raids and retaliation that grew more vivid with each telling. The man Takaku, she had once heard Doc Merritt call him, said nothing now. He simply looked down at her with an expression she could not read his face, as impassive as carved wood. Then he turned and walked into the trading post, the door banging shut behind him. Josephine's chest tightened with a humiliation so profound, it burned hotter than the cold. Even he would not help. Even a man who the town feared and despised had nothing to spare for her. She pulled Clara closer, feeling the baby's heartbeat flutter against her ribs, like something small and frightened trying to escape. The wind screamed across the street, and above her the trading post's wooden sign rattled on its chains, with a sound like bones breaking. The door opened again. Takaku emerged, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the cold. He walked directly to Josephine and crouched down, bringing himself to eye level. Up close, she could see more details, the fine network of scars across his knuckles, the calluses on his palms from bowstring, and Rains the faint white marks around his wrists, where ropes had once bitten deep and left permanent tracks. Without speaking, he unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside were 4 items, 2 tins of Borden's condensed milk with their labels still bright and legible, a small earthenware crock of butter, and a glass jar of rendered lard. provisions worth at least $3 more food than Josephine had seen in a month. "I cannot pay." Josephine stammered, her voice cracking. "I have nothing. I have no money, no goods to trade. I cannot." He reached out and gently closed her fingers around the tins. His gloved hands were steady over hers, the touch firm, but careful, like someone who had learned through painful experience not to break fragile things. His dark eyes held hers for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough-shaped around English words with the deliberate precision of someone speaking a second language. "Keep the child warm. Storm's not finished with us." Before Josephine could respond, a sudden gust of wind shrieked down the street with renewed violence, snapping one of the signboard's chains. The board swung wild and loose, and Harmon's mule tied to the post nearby reared and kicked out in panic. The milk tin slipped from Josephine's numb fingers, and Takaku's hand shot out with startling speed, catching it before it could hit the frozen ground. For a heartbeat, they both held it, his gloved palm beneath her bare fingers, above the warmth of his hand, seeping through the leather and into her frozen skin. Clara stirred in her blanket, her breath fogging white against Tachaku's wrist. He looked down at the baby, and something flickered across his expression. Pain old and deep and carefully contained, like a wound that had healed crooked and still ached when the weather changed. Then he placed the tin securely back in Josephine's arms and stood, his movements fluid despite his size. "The milk," he said, nodding toward the tins. "Mix with warm water, not too thick. 2 parts water to 1 part milk. She'll take it slow at first. Give her time." "Why?" The word escaped Josephine before she could stop it. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Tachaku's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced back at the trading post, where faces pressed against the window, Harmon the blacksmith, 2 miners she did not recognize, all watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. When he looked at her again, his face had settled into something harder, more guarded. "Storm's not finished," he repeated. Then he turned and walked away, his boots crunching through the snow toward the edge of town, where the teepee lodges stood in a loose cluster, smoke rising thin and gray against the white sky. Josephine sat there for a long moment, the tins heavy in her lap, Clara's weak cries slowly building into hungry whimpers. Her hands shook as she tucked the provisions carefully into her shawl, wrapping them tight against her body. Around her, she could feel the weight of the town's attention shopkeepers in doorways, women peering from behind frost-glazed windows, miners slouched against walls with the particular stillness of men who were watching something they might talk about later. She could feel their judgment settling over her shoulders like a yoke. But she did not care. For the first time in 6 days, she had milk. Clara would live another day, maybe 2. That was enough. That was everything. As she struggled to her feet, her frozen skirts cracking like paper, her gaze drifted involuntarily toward the distant teepee camp. The lodges were arranged in a loose semicircle, their painted hides faded by weather and time, geometric patterns still visible in reds and yellows and blacks. She could see figures moving among them, women bent over hide-scraping frames, children chasing each other through the snow dogs, nosing for scraps. And at the edge of the camp, standing with his arms crossed and his buffalo robe pulled tight, was Tachaku. Even from this distance, even through the driving snow, she could feel the weight of his attention. She did not know if he was watching to make sure she made it home, or watching for some other reason she could not fathom. Perhaps both. The wind gusted again, and Josephine turned away, forcing her frozen legs to carry her up the hill toward her cabin. Behind her, the town watched. Ahead, the gray sky promised more snow. And somewhere in between, something had begun that neither she nor Takaku yet understood. The storm, he had said, was not finished. She believed him. Sorrow Hill was not a town that inspired hope. It was a collection of desperation held together by frozen mud and broken promises built around a silver vein in Red Willow Gulch that had played out 2 years after the first prospectors arrived. What remained was a single spur rail line that brought supplies twice monthly when the weather permitted, a trading post that extended credit at rates that would have been criminal in Cincinnati, and perhaps 200 souls too stubborn or too poor to leave. The town clung to the eastern slope of a long ridge, the buildings arranged in rough tiers like crooked teeth. At the bottom sat the rail depot, the Smithy and Harmon's trading post. Mid-slope held Doc Merritt's office with its hand-painted shingle that read, "Physician, Dentistry, Veterinary, Whiskey." The schoolhouse where Miss Eliza Pike taught 20 children of varying ages and commitment, and the assayer's office that had been closed since the silver dried up. At the top of the slope, the residential cabins perched in a ragged line, growing smaller and more decrepit the farther they climbed. Josephine Kessler's cabin was second from the end, a single-room structure built from green lumber that had warped as it dried. The stone chimney smoked when the wind came from the west, which it usually did. The floorboards had gaps wide enough to see the frozen ground beneath, and the single window was patched with oiled paper where a pane had cracked and been too expensive to replace. Heinrich had built it 3 years earlier when they arrived from Ohio, full of talk about silver strikes and fresh starts, and leaving behind the cramped rooms above her father's print shop in Cincinnati. Those dreams were buried now in the collapsed tunnel of the Red Willow mine, along with Heinrich's body and those of 5 other men. The mine company had ruled it operator error and paid nothing. Everyone knew the truth. Burke Lathrop, the foreman, had refused to replace rotten support timbers because new timber cost money and the vein was drying up anyway. But no one said it aloud because Lathrop still had friends and miners still needed work. Josephine stood at her cabin's small window in the pale morning light, watching dawn break colorless over the prairie. Clara slept fitfully in the wooden crate that served as a cradle wrapped in every blanket and shawl Josephine owned, which was not many. The milk Takasku had given them 5 days ago was nearly gone despite Josephine's efforts to stretch it, mixing it thinner and thinner until it was barely more than cloudy water. But even that was more than Clara had eaten in the 2 weeks prior, and the baby's cheeks had regained a hint of pink. Her breathing came easier. Still, the milk would be gone by tomorrow, and Josephine had nothing left to trade. She had already sold her wedding ring, Heinrich's pocket watch, their good cooking pot, the quilt her mother had sewn as a wedding gift. All that remained were the clothes on her back, the accounting ledgers from her brief employment in Cincinnati, and Heinrich's rifle, which she had tried to sell to the blacksmith who had offered her $2 for a weapon worth $20 because he knew she had no other buyer. She turned from the window and moved to the small table where her ledgers lay open. Even now, even half-starved and desperate, the habit of keeping accounts soothed something in her. Before marrying Heinrich, she had worked as a bookkeeper for her father's printing business, unusual work for a woman, but her father had been practical, and she had been good with numbers. Here in Sorrow Hill, that skill was worthless. No one needed books balanced. They needed strong backs or gold or things Josephine refused to think about too directly. The ledger showed what she already knew: $17 owed to Harmon for credit extended last winter, $8 to the Smithy for firewood, $12 to Doc Merritt for attending Heinrich's final fever, though he had told her to pay when she could. The mine company had paid nothing for Heinrich's death. The other widows whispered that they had received $50 each, but Josephine had been told there was no death benefit because Heinrich had been found to have contributed to the collapse through improper timbering. A lie, but a lie she could not fight. A knock rattled the door, 3 sharp raps, followed by 2 softer ones. Josephine recognized the pattern and relaxed slightly. She opened the door to find Doc Merritt standing on her threshold, his medical bag in one hand and the other shoved deep in his coat pocket. He was somewhere past 50 with gray stubble and red-rimmed eyes that had seen too much suffering to register shock anymore. But he had attended Heinrich without demanding immediate payment, and he had checked Clara twice without even mentioning money, so Josephine trusted him as much as she trusted anyone. "May I see the child?" he asked without preamble. Josephine stepped aside. Doc Merritt moved to the crate and examined Clara with practiced efficiency, checking her color, listening to her breathing. With a battered stethoscope, feeling the fontanelle on her skull, pinching gently at the skin on her arm to check for dehydration. After a long moment, he straightened. "Better," he said. "Significantly better. Whatever you've been feeding her, keep at it. The milk is almost gone." Doc Merritt's mouth tightened. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the meager supplies, the damp firewood stacked along one wall, the general atmosphere of barely controlled desperation. "There's talk in town," he said carefully, "about you accepting food from the Indian camp. One man gave me milk for my child. I did not ask his nation or his reasons. I'm not saying you did wrong." Doc Merritt pulled out a small flask, took a swallow, wiped his mouth. "But folks are nervous. Army's been stirring up trouble north Powder River country, Little Bighorn. Rumor is the tribes are gathering, getting ready for a big fight. People see you talking to Takaku, they start getting ideas." "What kind of ideas?" "The kind that lead to questions you don't want asked." Doc Merritt hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "You should know who he is. Takaku's Minikonju Lakota. His band's been trading here for years, peaceful as can be. But that scar on his face, he got that at Powder River last November. Army patrol caught his camp at dawn, killed 14 people. His sister Huleza was one of them. He took that bullet trying to carry her out." Josephine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "They killed a woman. Army calls it a skirmish. Lakota call it murder." Doc Merritt shrugged, but his face was hard. "I was called out to treat one of the wounded white man Army scout who got caught in crossfire. He told me things before he died. Things that don't match the official story. Lieutenant Silas Hart led that patrol, and I don't think he's telling the truth about what happened." "What does this have to do with me?" "Hart's at the depot now, running security for the railroad. He's ambitious, wants glory, wants a reputation before the big fight everyone says is coming. You're a white widow, taking food from a Lakota warrior who lost his sister in an Army attack. That's a story that gets twisted real easy, and once it's twisted, you can't untwist it." He paused. "If you need help, real help, go to Eliza Pike at the schoolhouse. She's got more spine than the rest of this town put together, and she won't judge you." After Doc Merritt left, Josephine returned to the window. She could just see the edge of the Lakota camp from here, the teepees arranged with their openings facing east. Smoke rose steadily from the morning fires. She watched a woman emerge from one lodge carrying a water skin, watched children run past chasing a dog, watched the ordinary rhythms of life continue in defiance of the cold. And she watched Takaku step out from one of the teepees, his breath fogging in the cold air, and turned to look directly at her cabin, as if he knew she was watching. Josephine stepped back from the window quickly, her heart beating faster than it should. She did not know what to make of him. His kindness made no sense. In her experience, men did not give things without expecting something in return, and frontier men especially did not help women without strings attached. Yet Takaku had asked for nothing, said almost nothing, simply given her food and walked away. That night, after Clara had finally fallen asleep and the cabin was dark except for the dim glow of banked coals in the fireplace, Josephine heard a soft scrape outside her door. She froze, hand reaching automatically for the iron poker beside the hearth. The scrape came again, then silence. She waited a full minute before opening the door a crack. On her threshold sat a bundle wrapped in tanned hide strips of dried venison, a handful of dried choke cherries, a small pouch of cornmeal tied with sinew, and folded carefully beneath it all was a shawl unlike anything Josephine had ever seen. It was made from some kind of soft hide, dyed in shades of red and cream, decorated with intricate quill work in geometric patterns that seemed to flow like water. The workmanship was extraordinary. Each quill precisely placed the colors, still vibrant despite obvious age. Josephine brought the bundle inside and examined the shawl by candlelight, running her fingers over the quill work. It was the kind of work that took weeks, maybe months. The kind of thing someone made with love and patience. She thought of Takaku's scarred hands, his careful way of handling the milk tin, the flicker of old pain in his face when he looked at Clara. She did not know why he was helping her, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she owed him more than gratitude. She owed him the truth of her appreciation, spoken plainly the way honest people did. Tomorrow she decided she would find a way to thank him properly. She would go to the camp regardless of what the town thought, and she would speak her gratitude face to face. She wrapped herself in the quilled shawl, feeling its warmth settle over her shoulders, and allowed herself to sleep deeply for the first time in weeks. Outside, the wind continued to howl. But inside, for this one night, Josephine Kessler felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. The soldiers came at midday, on the 6th day after Takaku's gift, when the town was at its sluggish midday lull. Josephine was at the communal well hauling water with Clara, strapped against her chest in the quilled shawl, when she heard the hoofbeats, rhythmic military, too many to be casual. Lieutenant Silas Hart led the patrol's 6 soldiers in dusty blue uniforms, with yellow cavalry piping their Springfield Model 1873 trap-door carbines slung across their backs. Hart was a thin man in his early 30s, with pale eyes the color of ice melt and a mustache waxed to stiff points. He carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had studied military bearing from a manual and practiced it in front of a mirror. He reined his horse in front of Harmon's trading post and dismounted with precise movements. "Requisition order," Hart announced, his voice carrying clearly across the street. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat with a flourish. "By authority of the United States Army Department of the Platte, all surplus provisions in this territory are to be secured for military use pending operations against hostile forces." Harmon emerged from his store, his face already red. "What in blazes does that mean in plain English?" "It means we're taking your flour, Mr. Harmon. All of it." Hart handed him the paper. "You'll be compensated. File a claim at Fort Laramie." Fort Laramie's 3 weeks' ride through hostile territory. "Then I suggest you start soon." Hart gestured to 2 of his soldiers who dismounted and entered the trading post. A moment later, they emerged carrying a large barrel between them and the last keg of flour Harmon had received on last week's train. It would be another 2 weeks, maybe 3, before the next shipment arrived, if it arrived at all. A crowd gathered quickly, miners off-shift, women with marketing baskets, children drawn by the commotion. Josephine stood at the edge, her arms tightening instinctively around Clara. Without that flour, the town would be eating hardtack and whatever game could be brought down until the next train, and no one knew when that would be. The spring melt made the rails unreliable. "This is robbery at gunpoint," Harmon said, his voice shaking with anger. "You can't just take a man's inventory." Hart's hand drifted casually to the revolver holstered at his belt. "This is military necessity, Mr. Harmon. We're at war, even if this backwater hasn't noticed. If you have complaints, take them up with the territorial governor in Cheyenne. I'm sure he'll be very interested." No one moved. The soldiers loaded the flour barrel onto a pack mule with efficient movements. Hart remounted his horse, but before he could give the order to move out, his gaze swept across the crowd and stopped on Josephine. His pale eyes narrowed slightly. "You're Kessler's widow," he said. It was not a question. Josephine forced herself to meet his stare. I am. I've seen you speaking with the Indians. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, and Josephine felt the crowd's attention shift, felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. A man gave me food for my child, she said, keeping her voice level despite the fear rising in her throat. I did not inquire as to his tribe or his politics. That man is Takaku of the Minikonju band. Hart said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. He's wanted by the army for theft of government property and suspected involvement in raids along the Powder River last year. There's a $50 reward for information leading to his capture. A murmur ran through the crowd, surprised speculation and the particular sound of people recalculating their opinions and their options. $50 was 2 months' wages for a miner, 6 months for a ranch hand. In a town like Sorrow Hill, it was a fortune. I know nothing of any crimes, Josephine said carefully. Then you won't mind if I tell you to stay away from the Indian camp. Hart said, his tone making it clear it was not a suggestion. Consorting with hostiles is a serious matter, Mrs. Kessler. The Army takes a dim view of civilians who provide aid and comfort to enemies of the United States. I'd hate to see you arrested for treason. The word hung in the air like a physical threat. Josephine's mouth went dry. Hart smiled slightly, touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy, and rode off his patrol, following in neat formation. The crowd dispersed, slowly muttering. Josephine felt their stares following her. As she hurried back to her cabin, Clara clutched tight against her chest. Her hands shook so badly, it took 3 tries to light the fire. $50. Hart had just placed a bounty on Takaku's head, and he had done it in front of the entire town. She had to warn him. Whatever he was accused of, true or false, Hart's announcement had made him a target. In a town full of desperate, hungry people, $50 would buy a lot of betrayal. That night she lay awake, listening to Clara's breathing and the wind rattling the window frame. She thought about Hart's cold eyes, about the casual way he had threatened her, about the flour barrel being loaded onto that mule. Something was wrong. The Army did not requisition flour from civilian populations unless they were planning prolonged operations, and prolonged operations meant they expected to be out in the field for weeks or months. Which meant Hart believed a major conflict was coming. And if a major conflict was coming, then Hart would want to make sure there were no complications in his rear area. No Indians trading peacefully at the edge of town. No inconvenient witnesses to whatever had happened at Powder River. Josephine made her decision. She would go to the camp tomorrow in full daylight, and she would warn Takaku. Let the town watch. Let them judge. Clara was alive because of his kindness, and Josephine Kessler paid her debts. She wrapped herself in the quilled shawl and finally slept, dreaming of gunfire and snow. But when morning came, she woke to the smell of smoke, thick and acrid, not the clean scent of cook fires, but the choking stench of burning hide and wood. She ran to the window and saw across the town a pillar of black smoke rising from where the Lakota camp had stood. Someone had already collected Hart's bounty. Josephine ran. She did not think, did not plan, simply snatched Clara from the crate and ran down the hill toward the smoke. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her skirts tangling around her legs, but she did not slow until she reached the edge of what had been the camp. 3 of the 4 teepees were burning, the hide covers collapsing inward as the support poles charred and failed. The 4th had been torn down completely, its contents scattered across the snow. A handful of people stood nearby, Burke Lathrop, the former mine foreman, along with 2 men Josephine recognized as drifters, who sometimes worked as ranch hands or guards. They were laughing, passing a whiskey bottle. "Where are they?" Josephine demanded, her voice shaking. Where did they go? Lathrop turned his face, flushed with whiskey and satisfaction. Who? The people who lived here. Indians, Lathrop shrugged. Scattered like rabbits when we showed up. Didn't even put up a fight. Cowards, the lot of them. You attacked their camp. We collected a bounty, Lathrop corrected. Hart said the Lakota was wanted. We come to arrest him, but he ran off before we could get close. So we figured burning his lodge would flush him out. He grinned. Worked pretty good. Where did they go? How should I know? North, probably. Toward the hostile camps. Lathrop's grin widened. You seem mighty concerned about savages, Mrs. Kessler. People might get the wrong idea. Josephine turned away before she said something she would regret. She walked back through town in a daze, Clara whimpering against her chest. People watched from doorways and windows, but no one spoke to her. By the time she reached her cabin, the rage had set in, cold and clear and unshakable. She gathered what few supplies she had, the last of the milk. The venison and cornmeal Takaku had left the quilled shawl. She wrapped everything in a bundle, strapped Clara against her chest, and walked back down the hill to the still-smoking camp. The fires had burned down to embers. Josephine walked through the wreckage, carefully looking for anything salvageable. Most of the possessions had been destroyed, but in the remains of one teepee, she found a small parfleche bag that had been protected by fallen hides. Inside were women's things, bone needles, sinew thread, a few glass beads, and a small quilled medallion in the same pattern as the shawl Takaku had given her. She was examining the medallion when she heard the voice behind her. You shouldn't be here. Josephine spun. Takaku stood at the edge of the camp, his buffalo robe pulled tight, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His face was expressionless, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the barely controlled anger in the set of his jaw. They burned your camp. Josephine said the words, tumbling out. Lathrop and his men. They said they were collecting Hart's bounty, but you weren't here, so they... I know what they did. Takaku's voice was flat. I was hunting. I came back and found the fires. Where are your people? Gone. Scattered. My cousin took an arrow in the leg from one of Lathrop's men, but he'll live. The others headed north toward the Bighorn Mountains. He looked at the burning lodges, and something in his face made Josephine's chest tighten. This was my sister's teepee, the one they burned first. Josephine held out the parfleche bag. I found this. I thought you might want it. Takaku took the bag slowly, his fingers brushing against hers. He opened it and removed the quilled medallion, holding it up to the light. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his voice came rough and low. Huleza made this. She was teaching the children to do quill work when the soldiers came to Powder River. This pattern. He traced the geometric design with one finger. She always said it was a map, the way home. I'm sorry, Josephine whispered. Don't be sorry. Be careful. Takaku looked at her, and for the first time, she saw real fear in his face. Hart's not going to stop. He'll use this as proof we're hostile, that we attacked Lathrop's men. He'll send soldiers to hunt us and anyone who helped us. You need to go home, lock your door, and stay away from me. But I mean it. His hand closed around hers, squeezing hard enough to hurt. They killed my sister for being in the wrong place. I won't let them kill you too. Before Josephine could respond, a shout split the air. She turned to see 3 riders cresting the hill, Lathrop and his men clearly returning to search the ruins more thoroughly. Takaku shoved the parfleche into Josephine's hands. Run, he said. Back to town, now. What about you? I'll lead them away. Go. A rifle shot cracked across the morning air, kicking up snow 3 feet from where they stood. Takaku grabbed Josephine's arm and ran, pulling her away from the camp toward the tree line. Behind them, more shots, the thunder of hoofbeats. Clara screamed, her cries cutting through the chaos. They reached the trees, and Takaku pulled Josephine down behind a fallen log. His body covered hers and Clara's, his weight, pressing them into the frozen earth. She could feel his heart pounding against her back, could smell wood smoke and leather, and something else, fear human and raw. "When I move," he said into her ear, "you run for town. Don't look back. Don't stop. Understand?" "No. Understand?" "Yes." Takaku rolled away and brought his rifle up, firing twice in quick succession. One of the riders yelped and tumbled from his saddle. The other 2 scattered, seeking cover. Takaku grabbed Josephine's wrist and ran, pulling her deeper into the trees, Clara's screams echoing through the forest. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, until Josephine's lungs burned and her legs refused to carry her farther. Takaku pulled her into a narrow ravine and pressed her against the frozen rock face, his hand over her mouth, his breathing harsh in her ear. Above, she could hear the riders searching, their voices carrying in the cold air. "Lost them," one voice said. "Tracks head north." "Lathrop's going to be furious," another voice replied. "That's the second time that savage got away." "We'll get him. Hart wants him bad enough he'll pay more than 50. The voices faded. Takaku kept his hand over Josephine's mouth for another long minute, then slowly released her. Clara had stopped screaming and now whimpered softly, her face pressed against Josephine's chest. "Is she hurt?" Takaku asked quietly. "No, just frightened." "So am I." Takaku's hands moved over Clara, checking carefully, and then he looked at Josephine with an expression so raw it hurt to see. "You can't go back to town. Hart will hear about you being at the camp. He'll arrest you or worse." "Then what do I do?" Takaku was silent for a long moment. Then he made a decision. "We run. North to the Sweetwater Ferry crossing. There's a missionary station on the other side, Fort Washakie. They'll help you get east away from all this." You think I'm letting you walk through hostile territory alone with a baby?" Takaku's mouth twisted into something that was almost a smile. "You saved my sister's things. That means you're under my protection now, whether you want it or not." Josephine looked at him, this man who had given her milk, who had saved her life twice now, who looked at Clara with such carefully hidden grief. And she made her own decision. "All right," she said. "We run together." Takaku nodded. He checked his rifle, counted his ammunition, then gestured north. "Stay close. The terrain gets rough from here." They left the ravine and moved into the wild country beyond Sorrow Hill's grasp, leaving behind the smoking ruins and the watching town and the life Josephine had tried to build from the wreckage of her marriage. Ahead lay only uncertainty and danger. But for the first time since Heinrich died, Josephine was not facing it alone. The prairie, in early April, was a landscape of contradictions, frozen hard at night, turning to mud by midday, refreezing at dusk into treacherous ruts that could break an ankle. Josephine and Takaku moved through it, slowly conserving strength, stopping frequently to let Josephine rest and feed Clara from the dwindling milk supply. On the first night, they sheltered in a shallow cave formed by an overhanging rock face. Takaku built a fire so small it barely cast light, the flames hidden deep in the cave so they would not be visible from a distance. He produced jerky and hardtack from a pack Josephine had not seen him carrying, and they ate in silence, the food tough and flavorless but sustaining. "Where did you learn English?" Josephine asked after a while, more to break the oppressive silence than from real curiosity. T'Chaku looked up from sharpening his knife. Jesuit mission school when I was young. My father thought it would help us trade with whites. He was right, but not in the way he hoped. What do you mean? Learning their language meant hearing their promises. And hearing their promises meant understanding when they broke them. He tested the knife's edge against his thumb. Sometimes ignorance is better. Josephine thought about that. My husband used to say Americans had to speak English or go back where they came from. But he never learned more than 5 words of Lakota, even though we lived here for 3 years. What were the 5 words? Hello, goodbye. How much? Too much. No deal. T'Chaku's mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Sounds about right. They fell silent again. Clara slept between them, wrapped in the quilled shawl and both their coats. The fire crackled softly. Outside, wind moaned across the prairie like something lost and searching. Tell me about your sister, Josephine said quietly. T'Chaku went very still. For a long moment she thought he would not answer. Then he set down the knife and stared into the small flames. Huleza was 3 years younger than me. Her name means bare legs because she was always running off without her leggings when she was small. His voice was soft, remembering. She was the best quill worker in our band. Patient. Careful. She could make beautiful things from nothing dye porcupine quills with roots and berries, arrange them into patterns that told stories. The shawl I gave you, she made that for her marriage. But her husband died of winter fever 2 years ago, and she never married again. She had no children. T'Chaku's jaw tightened. No. She said the children of the band were enough. She taught them everything quill work, beadwork, stories, songs. She was teaching them the morning the soldiers came. Josephine's throat felt tight. How many children died? 4, all under 10 winters. T'Chaku's voice had gone flat, emotionless. The soldiers said we were harboring hostiles. There were no hostiles, just families trying to survive the winter. And Hart led that patrol? Yes. Why attack a peaceful camp? T'Chaku looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something cold and knowing. Because killing peaceful Indians is easier than fighting warriors. And because Hart needed a victory to put in his report. Dead is dead. The army doesn't ask too many questions about how many were women and children. Josephine felt sick. She looked down at Clara, sleeping peacefully, and tried to imagine someone deciding this child was an acceptable target simply because of where she was born. The thought was obscene. I'm sorry, she whispered. Everyone's sorry. Nobody does anything. I'm doing something now. I'm running with you. T'Chaku looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. Yes, you are. He reached out and adjusted the coat around Clara, his movements gentle. Thank you. They sat in silence until the fire burned down to embers, then slept in shifts, one always watching while the other rested. In the deep hours of night, when it was Josephine's turn to keep watch, she found herself studying T'Chaku's face in the dim light, the sharp lines of his cheekbones, the scar cutting through his temple, the way his hands remained curved around his rifle, even in sleep. He was not a handsome man by conventional measures, but there was something compelling about him, something solid and real that made the rest of the world feel less substantial. She wondered what he had been like before Powder River, before the scar and the grief. She wondered if he had laughed easily, if he had been quick to smile. Somehow she doubted it. He had the look of someone who had been carrying weight for a long time. Dawn came gray and cold. They ate the last of the jerky, drank melted snow from T'Chaku's canteen, and moved north again. The landscape grew more broken as they left the prairie behind gullies and dry creek beds stands of cottonwood, and willow marking places, where water ran in summer rocky outcroppings that offered both shelter and danger. On the second day, they crossed a frozen stream, and Takaku paused, studying the far bank. Josephine weighted Clara drowsy against her chest and watched as he crouched and examined something she could not see. "Tracks," he said quietly. "Shod horses. 4 riders, maybe 5, moving west." He looked back the way they had come, his face troubled. "They're ahead of us. Lathrop. Or soldiers. Either way, we need to be more careful." He stood and scanned the terrain. "We'll move at night from now on. Sleep during the day, travel after dark." "Can we do that with Clara?" Tachaku looked at the baby, his expression unreadable. "We'll have to." That night they walked under a sky so clear and cold, the stars looked close enough to touch. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see by turning the landscape into a study in silver and shadow. Josephine walked until her feet were numb, until Clara's weight seemed to double, until she was stumbling more than stepping. Tachaku caught her before she fell. His arm came around her waist, supporting her, and they walked that way for a while, pressed close, sharing warmth, moving as one person. Josephine found herself noticing things she should not, and the strength in his arm, the warmth of his body against her side, the way he matched his longer stride to hers without comment. "We'll rest," he said after a while, though the night was not yet half over. "I can keep going." "So can I. But the child needs to sleep somewhere warm, and you need to sleep somewhere you won't fall off a cliff in the dark." He found a sheltered spot in a ring of boulders and built another tiny fire. While Josephine fed Clara the last of the condensed milk mixed with melted snow, Takaku pulled out a twist of cloth from his pack and unwrapped it to reveal a handful of wild onions, dirt still clinging to their roots. "Found these while you were resting yesterday," he said. "We can roast them, make a mash for the baby if you mix it thin." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you." "Thank me when we reach the ferry." They roasted the onions in the coals and mashed them with warm water. Clara ate slowly, making faces at the bitter taste, but she ate. Afterward, Takaku insisted Josephine sleep first while he kept watch. She was too exhausted to argue. She woke to find Takaku sitting close beside her, his rifle across his lap, his free hand resting on Clara's back as the baby slept against Josephine's chest. He looked down when he felt her stir. "Wolves," he said quietly. "They came close about an hour ago. I put more wood on the fire and they moved off." Josephine's breath caught. She had not heard anything. "It's all right," Takaku said, seeing her fear. "They were just curious. We're too much trouble to bother with." "How do you know?" "Because I'm still alive to tell you." He smiled slightly, and Josephine realized it was the first time she had seen any real humor in his face. It transformed him, made him look younger, less burdened. "You should sleep," she said. "I will. But first..." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. "This belonged to Huleza. I want you to have it." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a bone needle case, intricately carved with the same geometric patterns as the quilled shawl. Inside were several bone needles and a coil of fine sinew thread. "I can't take this," Josephine protested. "Yes, you can. You'll need it when your clothes wear through, and they will wear through. Huleza would want someone to use it." He pressed it into her hands. "Besides, you saved her parfleche from the fire. This is a fair trade." Josephine looked at the needle case, then at Takaku. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because kindness is rare. And because you're raising a child in a world that wants to kill her. That takes courage, and courage deserves help." Before Josephine could respond, he lay down and rolled onto his side, his back to the fire, signaling the conversation was over. But Josephine sat awake for a long time, holding the needle case and watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing. By the fourth day, Josephine's boots were falling apart, and Clara had developed a cough that tore at her tiny chest. Takaku walked ahead, his rifle ready, his movements tense. They were deep in rough country, now broken badlands, where the rocks stood in strange formations and the wind sang through gaps like voices. "How much farther?" Josephine asked during one of their brief rest stops. 2 days to the river, maybe 3. And then we cross and hope Hart hasn't sent word ahead. Josephine was about to respond when Takaku suddenly went rigid, his head cocked. Then she heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats coming from the south. "Into the rocks," Takaku hissed. "Now." They scrambled up a steep slope into a cluster of wind-carved formations. Takaku pulled Josephine down behind a boulder and pressed his hand over her mouth just as Clara started to fuss. Josephine put her hand over the baby's mouth, gentle but firm, and Clara's eyes went wide, but she made no sound. The hoofbeats grew louder. Through a gap in the rocks, Josephine could see riders, 5 of them, led by a man in buckskins with long gray hair and a rifle slung across his back. Red Petty, the Army scout Doc Merritt had mentioned. Behind him rode 4 others, their faces hard and weather-worn. "Tracks head north." Petty said, his voice carrying in the clear air. 2 people, 1 small, moving slow. "How far ahead?" one of the others asked. "Half day, maybe less. They're tired making mistakes. We'll catch them by tomorrow if we push." "What's Hart paying again?" "50 for the Indian dead or alive. Another 20 for the woman if she's aiding and abetting." "That's good money." "That's very good money. Now shut up and ride." They passed within 100 yards, the sound of hoofbeats fading slowly to the north. Takaku kept his hand over Josephine's mouth for another full minute before releasing her. "They're ahead of us," he said grimly. "Which means they're going to circle back when they don't find tracks. We need to change direction." "To where? East?" "There's an old stage road that was abandoned when the rails came through. If we can reach it, we can follow it north to a different crossing point. It's farther, but safer." "How much farther?" 5 days, maybe 6. Josephine looked at Clara, at the baby's flushed cheeks and the rattle in her breathing. 6 days. She did not know if Clara had 6 days. "We don't have a choice," Takaku said, reading her face. "If Petty catches us, none of us will survive." "Then we go east," Josephine said. They left the rocks and moved perpendicular to their previous path, heading toward the sunrise. Behind them, the sound of returning hoofbeats confirmed Takaku's prediction. Petty had realized his error and was doubling back. But by the time the scout reached the place where their tracks turned, Josephine and Takaku were miles away, moving through country too rough for horses. That night, huddled in another cold camp, Josephine held Clara close and felt the baby's forehead burning with fever. Takaku produced a small packet of willow bark and showed her how to brew it into tea. "For fever," he said. "Give her small sips. It tastes bitter, but it will help." "How do you know?" "My mother was a healer. She taught me what plants to use." He paused. "I couldn't save Huleza with that knowledge. But maybe I can save Clara." They worked together through the night, spooning bitter tea into Clara's mouth, bathing her hot skin with snow, keeping her warm when chills set in. Somewhere toward dawn, the fever broke, and Clara slept peacefully for the first time in 2 days. Josephine slumped against Takaku's shoulder, exhausted beyond measure. His arm came around her automatically, holding her steady. "Thank you," she whispered. "We're not safe yet." "I know," but thank you anyway." She felt him press his cheek against her hair for just a moment, a gesture so brief she might have imagined it. Then he shifted away and began preparing for another day of running. On the 7th day, they reached the old stage road, barely more than 2 ruts cutting through the grass, but visible enough to follow. T'Chaku studied it carefully before committing. "No recent tracks," he said. "We might be ahead of them now. Or they might be waiting up ahead." "Yes." He looked at her. "Are you sure you want to keep going? I could take you back to Sorrow Hill, claim I kidnapped you. Hart might believe it." "He won't believe it, and I'm not going back." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." T'Chaku nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and cupped her face with one scarred hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You're stronger than you look, Josephine Kessler." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his voice made something warm unfold in her chest. "So, are you T'Chaku of the Minikonju?" He smiled a real smile this time, reaching his eyes, and for a moment the exhaustion and fear fell away. And she saw the man he might have been in a different world, a different life. Then Clara stirred, and the moment passed, but something had changed between them. Something neither of them was quite ready to name. They walked north along the abandoned road, keeping to the shadows, moving toward an uncertain future. But they moved together, and that made all the difference. The old stage road wound through increasingly broken country, steep-sided canyons, dry washes, stretches of badlands, where the earth itself seemed determined to shake off anything living. On the 9th day, they reached a particularly nasty section, where the road clung to a cliff face above a rocky gorge. Josephine looked down at the drop and felt her stomach clench. "Is there another way?" she asked. "Yes. 3 days south, then back north." "We don't have 3 days." T'Chaku tested the edge of the road with his boot, sending a small cascade of stones rattling down into the gorge. "We go slow and careful. Don't look down." They edged along the cliff path, Josephine's back pressed against the rock face, Clara strapped so tight against her chest she could feel every flutter of the baby's heartbeat. Halfway across the path crumbled under T'Chaku's weight. He lunged forward, catching himself on a jutting rock, his rifle clattering down into the gorge. "Blast it!" He pulled himself back onto solid ground and checked his leg where the rock had scraped away a strip of skin. Blood welled up dark and thick. "You're hurt," Josephine said. "I'm fine, but that was my only rifle." He looked down at where the weapon had disappeared. "From here on, we're traveling defenseless. You still have your knife." "A knife's not much good against bullets." He tore a strip from his shirt and bound the wound, his movements quick and practiced. "Come on, we need to make distance while we can." That night, they found shelter in a small box canyon with a spring at its base, the first reliable water they had found in 3 days. While T'Chaku cleaned his wound properly, Josephine washed Clara and tried to wash their clothes. The baby had developed a rash from being confined in the same damp wrappings for so long, and Josephine's own skin itched beneath her layers of trail dirt. "We can rest here tomorrow," T'Chaku said, watching her work. "The canyon's defensible, and we all need real sleep." "Can we afford to stop? Can we afford not to?" He gestured at Clara. "She needs rest, you need rest, and I need time to make a new weapon." "Make what?" He picked up a straight branch that had fallen near the spring. "A bow. Not as good as a rifle, but quieter and just as deadly if you're close enough." Josephine watched as he began to work, using his knife to carefully shape the wood. His hands moved with absolute certainty, stripping bark, testing the flex, notching the ends for a string. It was clear he had done this 1,000 times. "Will it work?" she asked. "It'll have to." The next day they rested. Josephine spread their belongings in the sun to dry, while Takaku finished the bow and made arrows from straight sticks, turkey feathers he had collected along the trail, and stone chips he knapped with patient precision. By evening, he had a functional weapon crude by any standard, but deadly in skilled hands. He tested it by shooting at a dead tree 40 yards away. 5 shots, 5 hits within a handspan circle. Josephine was impressed despite herself. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "Same place I learned everything, surviving." He slung the bow across his back and collected his arrows. "We move at dawn. With luck, we'll reach the ferry crossing by tomorrow night." But luck Josephine was learning was not something they possessed. They were less than a day from the river when they heard the dogs. Not wolves, these were deliberate, organized the sound of trained hunting animals working a trail. Takaku's face went hard. "Petty's using dogs," he said. "That's how he got ahead of us. He guessed we'd changed direction and went straight to the river to cut us off." "What do we do?" Takaku looked around at the terrain, open ground for a quarter mile in every direction, nowhere to hide. Then he looked at the sun, low in the west, and made a decision. "We run, full out until we can't run anymore. The river's close. If we can reach it before they catch us, we might be able to swim across." "I can't swim that well." "Then I'll pull you." He grabbed her hand. "But we have to move now." They ran. Josephine ran until her chest felt like it would burst, until her legs were rubber, and her vision was nothing but tunnel darkness at the edges. Clara screamed the entire time, her wails cutting through the evening air, like signals marking their position. Behind them, the dogs grew louder. Takaku dragged Josephine up a steep embankment and down the other side, splashing through a shallow creek, climbing another rise. At the top, she could see a glint of water in the distance, wider than any stream, cutting through the land, like a silver scar. The sweet water. Takaku gasped. "We're close." But so were their pursuers. Josephine risked a glance back and saw riders cresting the embankment behind them, 3 men on horseback with dogs running ahead. One of the riders raised a rifle. The shot kicked up dirt 5 feet to their left. Takaku swerved right, pulling Josephine with him, and they stumbled down a slope into a dry wash. The banks were steep, offering cover, but Josephine knew it was only temporary. "Keep moving," Takaku said. "The wash leads toward the river." They ran along the washbed boots, slipping on smooth stones. Behind them, the dogs poured over the edge like a wave. Josephine heard Takaku curse, heard him skid to a stop. She looked back and saw him nocking an arrow, drawing the bow, releasing in one fluid motion. The lead dog yelped and tumbled, the arrow buried in its chest. Takaku knocked another arrow, shot again. A second dog fell. The pack hesitated, milling in confusion. "Go!" Takaku pushed Josephine ahead and followed, running backward, shooting as he went. He dropped a third dog before the riders reached the wash. Then there was no more time for shooting, only running. They burst out of the wash, and there was the river, wide and fast, swollen with snowmelt, carrying chunks of ice downstream like weapons. On the far side, Josephine could see buildings, the outline of a small settlement. Safety, if they could reach it. Takaku pulled her to the water's edge. "Can you hold on to me?" "Yes." "Then hold tight and don't let go no matter what." He waded into the water, and Josephine followed, gasping as the cold hit her like a fist. The current grabbed at her skirts, pulling insistent. Takaku's hand locked around her wrist, and he plunged forward, swimming with powerful strokes, towing her behind him. The water closed over Josephine's head. She surfaced, sputtering, Clara screaming, and saw a chunk of ice bearing down on them. Takaku saw it too, and shoved them aside, taking the impact on his shoulder. She heard him grunt in pain. But he did not let go, did not stop swimming. Behind them, gunfire. Bullets splashed into the water too close. Josephine ducked under again, came up coughing. Her boots dragged at her legs, her skirts a sodden weight trying to pull her down. Clara's cries were weakening her small body, going limp with cold. Takaku's hand found the bottom. He stood, water streaming from his hair and clothes, and hauled Josephine up beside him. They stumbled onto the far bank and collapsed in the mud, gasping. Across the river, Red Petty sat on his horse, watching them. He did not try to cross. After a long moment, he turned his horse and rode away, his remaining dogs trailing behind. Why didn't he follow? Josephine managed. He's smart enough to know when the job's not worth the pay, Takaku said. He rolled to his feet and helped Josephine stand. Come on. We need to get warm before we freeze. They staggered toward the settlement, leaving a trail of river water behind them. Josephine felt nothing, not her feet, not her hands, not even Clara's weight against her chest. She walked because Takaku pulled her, and because stopping meant dying, and she had come too far to die now. Someone was shouting, people running toward them. Josephine tried to focus, but her vision was blurring, the world tilting sideways. She felt Takaku's arm around her waist, felt herself being lifted, heard voices she did not recognize. Then warmth. Blessed, overwhelming warmth. And darkness. When she woke, she was lying on a narrow bed in a room lit by a single lantern. Her wet clothes had been replaced by a rough wool nightgown, and Clara lay beside her, wrapped in blankets and sleeping peacefully. Josephine reached out with shaking hands and felt the baby's chest rise and fall steadily. She's all right, a woman's voice said. Josephine turned her head and saw Eliza Pike sitting in a chair beside the bed. The schoolteacher looked exhausted, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, but her expression was calm. The cold wasn't good for her, but she'll recover. Takaku. Josephine's voice came out as a croak. In the next room, Doc Merritt's with him, stitching up his shoulder where the ice hit. He'll be sore for a while, but he'll live. Eliza leaned forward. You made it, Josephine. You're in Sweetwater now. Hart's authority doesn't reach this far. How did you get here? Doc and I left Sorrow Hill 2 days after you did. We knew Hart would come after you, and we couldn't stop him there. But we could get ahead of him and make sure you had help on this side of the river. Eliza's mouth twisted. Petty was working both sides, taking Hart's money, but also feeding Doc information. He's not a good man, but he's a practical one. When he saw you'd made it across, he decided collecting Hart's bounty wasn't worth dying for. Josephine closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her temples. They had made it. Against all odds, against Hart and Lathrop and Petty and the wilderness itself, they had made it. What happens now? She asked. Now you rest. And when you're strong enough, we figure out how to stop Hart before he kills anyone else. Josephine opened her eyes. Stop him how? Eliza's smile was sharp and cold. By telling the truth, all of it, and making sure everyone hears. In the next room, Josephine heard Takaku's low voice, and Doc Merritt's rougher one talking in tones too quiet to make out words. But she heard Takaku laugh, an actual laugh, short and surprised, and felt something warm bloom in her chest. They had made it. They were alive, and they were together. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way. For 3 days, Josephine and Takaku rested in the borrowed room above Sweetwater's dry goods store, recovering strength and waiting for their clothes to dry and be mended. Eliza moved between them like a tireless ghost, bringing food, changing bandages, watching the street for signs of pursuit. Doc Merritt treated Takaku's shoulder a deep bruise and split skin where the ice had hit, but no broken bones, and gave Clara a thorough examination, that ended with a satisfied grunt. "She's tougher than she looks," he said. "Takes after her mother that way." On the fourth day, Eliza returned from an errand with news. Hart sent word ahead. "There's a wanted poster at the ferry landing Takaku for theft and murder you for aiding a fugitive. $50 each, 100 for both together." Murder. Josephine felt her chest tighten. He killed no one. Lathrop's claiming one of his men died from injuries sustained when Takaku attacked the camp. It's a lie, but it's a useful lie. Makes Hart's hunt look justified. Takaku, sitting on the edge of his bed with his shoulder freshly bandaged, said nothing. His face was carefully neutral, but Josephine could see the anger in the set of his jaw. "So, what do we do?" Josephine asked. Eliza glanced at Doc Merritt, who had just entered carrying his ever-present flask. The doctor took a long swallow before speaking. "We fight back. With this." He set a worn leather satchel on the table and opened it to reveal a sheaf of papers, official documents, letters, requisition forms. "I've been collecting evidence for months. Hart's been running a supply theft operation since he arrived in the territory. Skimming provisions, selling them to settlers and miners, pocketing the money. The Powder River attack happened because Hart needed to cover up a missing shipment, claimed hostiles stole it, when really he'd sold it himself." Josephine moved to the table and picked up one of the documents. It was an Army requisition form dated November 1875, listing supplies sent to Sorrow Hill. Beside it was a waybill showing the same supplies arriving at various civilian addresses, including one that made her breath stop. Heinrich Kessler, Sorrow Hill, Wyoming Territory. 1 case preserved milk, 1 barrel flour, 1 infant female approx, 6 months old. The words blurred. Josephine read them again, her hands shaking. "He bought Clara," she whispered. "Heinrich bought her from Hart." "I'm sorry," Doc Merritt said quietly. "I found that receipt 2 weeks ago. The soldier who delivered her was dying of fever. He confessed everything. Hart told your husband the baby was an orphan from the Powder River attack, that she'd be better off with a white family. Heinrich paid $200 in silver." Josephine sat down heavily, the paper still clutched in her hands. Everything she had believed about her marriage, about Heinrich's insistence on adopting a child, about the mysterious circumstances of Clara's arrival. All lies. He had known. He must have known, or at least suspected. And he had paid anyway because an infant who could pass for white was a commodity worth having. She looked at Takaku, who was staring at the document with an expression she could not read. "Clara is Huleza's child," she said, her voice shaking. "That's why the quill work matched. That's why you helped us. You knew." "No." Takaku's voice was rough. "I didn't know. Not until now. But I wondered. The pattern on the shawl, I thought it was coincidence. But then when I saw Clara up close, I thought..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "She has her mother's eyes. I thought I was imagining it." Josephine looked down at Clara sleeping peacefully in the basket beside the bed. "She's your niece." "Yes." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Josephine felt her world tilt and resettle. The baby she had been feeding and protecting and loving for 6 months was not the orphan Heinrich had told her about. She was Takaku's blood, stolen from a massacre, sold like property. "You want her back?" Josephine said. It was not a question. Takaku looked at her for a long moment. "I want justice for Huleza. I want Hart to answer for what he did. But take Clara from you." He shook his head. "You're the only mother she's known. Taking her now would be another cruelty. She's had enough." "So what do? We make sure Hart can never hurt anyone else." We take this evidence to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. We make sure everyone knows what he did. He'll kill us before we get that far, Josephine said. Probably, Takaku agreed. Unless we kill him first. The room fell silent. Eliza and Doc Merritt exchanged glances. Then Eliza spoke, her voice measured. Or we bring him here. Force his hand. Make him come to us on ground we control. How? Takaku asked. By letting him know exactly where we are, and by making sure the whole town sees what happens when he arrives. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Doc Merritt spread word throughout Sweetwater that the fugitives from Sorrow Hill were hiding in the settlement, embellishing the story with enough juicy details that it was guaranteed to travel fast. Eliza organized the town's more sympathetic citizens, a surprisingly large number, and made sure they understood what was coming. Takaku crafted more arrows and practiced with his makeshift bow until he could hit a target at 60 yards. And Josephine transcribed Doc Merritt's evidence into a clear, legible document that even the most skeptical reader could not dismiss. On the evening of the 6th day, a rider came from the south, Hart with 12 soldiers and Burke Lathrop. They camped at the edge of town and sent word that they would be making arrests in the morning. That night, Josephine could not sleep. She sat at the window of their room, holding Clara and watching the distant campfires. Takaku moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and warm. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Josephine admitted. "But also angry. Heinrich used me. Hart used Heinrich. Clara was bought and sold like livestock. Someone needs to answer for that." "They will." "You can't promise that." "No," Takaku agreed. "But I can promise I'll do everything in my power to make it happen." Josephine looked up at him. In the lamplight, his face was all angles and shadows, the scar on his temple stark and white. She reached up without thinking and traced it with her fingertips. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Sometimes. When it's cold or when I'm tired." He caught her hand gently. "Why?" "Because I want to know everything about you. Because in a few hours we might both be dead, and I don't want to die not knowing." Takaku's thumb moved across her knuckles, a slow caress. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. But start with something simple. What's your favorite food?" He smiled that rare transforming smile. "Buffalo tongue roasted over coals. My mother made it for feast days." "Mine is apple strudel the way my grandmother made it in Germany. I haven't had it since I was 12. "What else?" They talked through the night, trading small intimacies, favorite seasons, worst injuries, childhood memories, secret fears. As dawn approached, Takaku's hand found hers and held it, and Josephine felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like coming home. "If we survive this," he said quietly, "I want to stay with you, help you raise Clara, teach her about her mother, about her people, if you'll have me." Josephine's throat tightened. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll have you." Takaku leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture she had seen Lakota couples make. It felt right. It felt like a promise. Then dawn broke, and there was no more time for promises. Hart's soldiers came at mid-morning, a show of force designed to intimidate. They formed up in the main street of Sweetwater carbines, held ready Hart at their front on a gray horse. The townspeople gathered, not fleeing, as Hart clearly expected, but assembling in a loose semicircle, watching. Hart's pale eyes swept the crowd and stopped on the dry goods store. "Send out the fugitives," he called. "Takaku of the Mini Kanju Band and Josephine Kessler. You're both under arrest by authority of the United States Army." Josephine stepped out onto the porch, Clara in her arms, Takaku beside her. Behind them, Doc Merritt and Eliza Pike emerged, carrying the satchel of evidence. "Under arrest for what crime?" Josephine called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Aiding a fugitive, theft of government property, consorting with hostiles." Hart's mouth twisted. "Do you want me to continue?" "I want you to tell the truth," Josephine said. "About Powder River. About the supplies you stole. About the baby you sold to my husband." A murmur ran through the crowd. Hart's expression did not change, but Josephine saw his hand tighten on his reins. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Doc Merritt stepped forward, holding up the documents. "I've got requisition forms with your signature, bills of sale, witness testimony from the soldier who delivered the baby to Heinrich Kessler. It's all here, Hart. Every crime documented." "Those are forgeries." "Then you won't mind if we send them to the territorial marshal for authentication." Eliza's voice cut sharp as a knife. "Or to the Army Inspector General. Or to every newspaper between here and Washington." Hart's face went cold. "You're making a serious mistake." "The only mistake was trusting you," Takaku said. He had his bow in hand, an arrow nocked but not drawn. "You killed my sister. You killed children. You stole a baby and sold her. Now you want to kill us to cover it up. But it's too late. Everyone here knows the truth now. The truth is, you're a hostile who attacked American soldiers. The truth," said a new voice, "is that you're a thief and a murderer." Red Petty stepped out from the crowd, his rifle held loosely, but his expression hard. "I tracked for you, Hart. I listened to you brag about how you were getting rich off supply theft while soldiers froze and starved. I watched you organize that attack on the Powder River camp. No hostile forces, just families wintering peacefully. You did it to cover your tracks, and you did it for glory. Well, I'm done carrying your water." Hart's soldiers shifted uneasily. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, and Josephine could see doubt in their faces. Hart saw it too, and his hand dropped to his sidearm. "Stand down," he ordered. "All of you. That's an order." "An order from a criminal," Doc Merritt said. "These men don't have to follow it." One of the soldiers, a boy with red hair and freckles, lowered his carbine. "Is it true, sir, about Powder River?" "Of course it's not true," Hart snapped. "They're lying to save themselves." "Then why is there a bill of sale with your signature?" The soldier persisted. "Why does it say you sold a baby?" Hart's control snapped. He drew his revolver and aimed it at Josephine. "Because that baby was spoils of war, and I can do what I want with spoils. Now put down those weapons or I'll—" The shot was deafening, but it did not come from Hart's gun. Takaku had drawn and released in one fluid motion, and the arrow punched through Hart's wrist. The revolver fell from his hand as he screamed, clutching his arm. Before anyone could react, Burke Lathrop charged from behind the soldiers, a knife in his hand, heading straight for Josephine. She stumbled back, clutching Clara, and Lathrop's knife slashed past her face, close enough that she felt the wind of it. Then Takaku was there, his bow cast aside, grappling with Lathrop. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt. Lathrop was larger, but Takaku was faster, getting his knife out and slamming it into Lathrop's thigh. Lathrop howled and rolled away, blood pouring from the wound. The soldiers surged forward, but the townspeople moved to block them, a wall of miners and shopkeepers and farmers who had seen enough injustice and decided to stand. For a moment it balanced on a knife's edge, violence, trembling on the verge of explosion. Then a new voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down, all of you." Sheriff Leeds pushed through the crowd, his badge bright on his chest, his rifle held ready. He had been away dealing with rustlers in the North Country, but he was back now, and his presence was a weight that shifted the balance. Someone better explain what's happening here. Leeds set his voice flat and hard. Doc Merritt handed him the satchel. Read those, then decide who's under arrest. Leeds took the documents and read them in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up at Hart, who was still clutching his bleeding wrist. Lieutenant Silas Hart, I'm placing you under arrest for theft of Army property, sale of stolen goods, and conspiracy to commit murder. Your men will escort you back to Fort Laramie to face court-martial. He looked at the soldiers. Any of you have a problem with that? The red-haired soldier shook his head. No, sir. Not if what we just read is true. It's true, Leeds said. He gestured to Lathrop, still bleeding in the dirt. Get him to a doctor, then lock him up. He'll face territorial charges. Hart's face was white with pain and rage. You're making a mistake, all of you. The Army will do what it does. Leeds interrupted. And if these documents are authentic, and I think they are, then the Army will hang you. Now shut up and let these men bind that wrist before you bleed out. The soldiers moved to obey their movements, stiff with shock and shame. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the tension bleeding away. Josephine sank to her knees. Clara clutched against her chest and felt Takaku's arms come around her from behind. It's over, he said into her hair. It's really over. Josephine closed her eyes and let herself believe it. Spring settled over the land with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic after the brutal winter. Sorrow Hill and Sweetwater both began to heal, though the process was slow and painful. Hart was court-martialed at Fort Laramie and found guilty on all charges. He was given 20 years hard labor at Fort Leavenworth. His commission stripped, his name struck from Army records. Lathrop faced territorial justice and received 15 years for his role in the crimes. Red Petty, in a turn no one had predicted, used his reward money, paid by Doc Merritt from a fund established by sympathetic townspeople, to purchase Asa Boone's abandoned farm outside Sorrow Hill. He proved surprisingly competent as a farmer, and over time earned a cautious acceptance from his neighbors. Eliza Pike returned to teaching, and her classroom filled with students whose parents had previously kept them home. Doc Merritt's practice grew busier as people who had avoided him out of fear or shame began seeking treatment. The town was not transformed. It remained hard and rough and unforgiving, but it was better. Marginally, incrementally better. Josephine and Takaku did not return to Sorrow Hill immediately. They stayed in Sweetwater through the worst of the spring mud, living in the room above the dry goods store, figuring out how to be a family. It was not simple. Takaku had nightmares about Powder River, waking with a hand reaching for weapons that were not there. Josephine had moments of crushing guilt about Heinrich, about how blind she had been to his crimes. And Clara, oblivious to the adult complexities around her, simply grew, getting heavier, learning to sit up, babbling sounds that were not yet words, but felt like communication. They did not marry. It was not possible under territorial law for a white woman to legally wed a native man, and neither of them felt the need for a ceremony that the law would not recognize. Instead, they made their own promises, spoken quietly in the dark, sealed with touch rather than words. I will stay with you as long as you want me, Takaku said one night. I want you forever, Josephine replied. Is that too much to ask? No. Forever sounds about right. When summer came, they returned to Sorrow Hill, not to Josephine's old cabin too full of ghosts, but to a new place on the south slope that Takaku and several members of his band built together. It was a hybrid structure, part cabin and part lodge, with a stone foundation and walls, but a hide roof that could be opened in good weather. The Mini Kanju band set up lodges nearby, and a fragile peace took hold. It was not perfect. There were still suspicious glances from townspeople, still muttered comments about the White Widow and her savage. But there were also people who greeted them in the street, who traded fairly, who accepted Clara's presence without question. Change came slowly, but it came. One evening in early autumn, as the light turned gold across the prairie, Josephine sat on the porch mending a shirt, while Takaku taught Clara, now over a year old, and walking unsteadily, how to stack smooth river stones. The baby laughed each time the stack toppled, and Takaku laughed with her, his scarred face transformed by joy. Doc Merritt came walking up the path, moving slower than he used to, but still steady. He sat on the porch step and watched the lesson for a moment. "Got something for you," he said finally. He pulled a small wooden box from his coat pocket. "Found this under a floorboard in your old cabin. Thought you should have it." Josephine took the box hesitantly. Inside was a letter in Heinrich's careful handwriting, dated 2 weeks before the mine collapse. She read it slowly, her stomach sinking. The letter was addressed to a business associate in Cheyenne. In it, Heinrich boasted about his acquisition of a child of unusual provenance and his plans to present her as an orphan to secure charitable donations from Eastern benefactors. He detailed the arrangement with heart the price paid the false documents created. It was proof, undeniable proof, that Heinrich had known exactly what he was doing. Josephine set down the letter and stared at it for a long time. Takaku came to sit beside her, Clara in his arms, and read the letter in silence. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Don't be. I need to know the truth. All of it." She looked at Clara, who was playing with Takaku's braid, completely content. He saw her as a commodity, an investment, but we see her as a child, as family. That's the difference. "What do you want to do with this?" Takaku held up the letter. Josephine thought for a moment. Then she stood and walked to the fire pit, where embers still glowed from the evening meal. She held the letter over the coals, watching the paper curl and blacken. "It's done," she said quietly. "Let it burn." Takaku joined her, pulling the quilled shawl from around his shoulders. The one Huleza had made the one that had started everything. He removed a few quills and added them to the fire, speaking words in Lakota that Josephine did not understand but felt in her bones. A prayer, a farewell, a release. They stood together as the fire consumed the past. Clara balanced between them and watched the smoke rise into the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Josephine asked. "Helping me that first day, everything that came after." Takaku looked at her, then at Clara, then back at the fire. "No," he said simply. "It led us here. That's enough." "Yes," Josephine agreed. "It is." The winter that followed was hard, but they survived it together. Takaku hunted and trapped. Josephine kept meticulous records of their supplies and managed their small household with German efficiency. Clara grew and thrived, learning words in both English and Lakota, showing no awareness that her existence was unusual or controversial. Spring came again, bringing with it news from the North. Disaster, at the Little Bighorn Custer's command, wiped out the tribes scattered and pursued by vengeful army columns. Refugees began trickling South Lakota and Cheyenne, fleeing the retribution that followed Custer's death. Takaku's band took in as many as they could, and Josephine found herself cooking for dozens, organizing supplies, helping where she could. The town's attitude toward the camp hardened again, fear overriding tentative acceptance. There were calls to expel all Indians from the territory, to burn the lodges and drive them north. Sheriff Leeds held firm, pointing to the evidence of Hart's crimes and reminding people that not all Lakota had been at the Little Bighorn. But it was a near thing. In the end, it was Clara who shifted the balance. Now 2 years old, she wandered freely between the cabin and the camp, speaking her hybrid language, accepted equally in both worlds. The townspeople watched her play with their own children, watched Takaku carry her on his shoulders through town. watched Josephine teach her to read from a primer in the schoolhouse. And slowly, grudgingly, they began to see her not as a symbol of anything, but simply as a child. One afternoon in late summer, Josephine was in the general store when a woman she barely knew approached her, Mrs. Brennan, wife of one of the miners. "My daughter wants to learn beadwork," the woman said abruptly. "I hear the Lakota women are skilled at it. Would they teach her?" Josephine blinked in surprise. Yes, I think so. I can ask." "Thank you." Mrs. Brennan hesitated, then added, "You did a good thing standing up to Hart. My husband always said he was crooked. We should have spoken up sooner. It was not much, not forgiveness, not even full acceptance. But it was something. A small step towards something better." That night, Josephine told Takaku about the conversation. He listened in silence, Clara asleep in his lap, then nodded slowly. "Maybe there's hope," he said. "For her, anyway." He looked down at Clara, his expression soft. "Maybe she'll grow up in a world that's a little less cruel." "Maybe," Josephine agreed. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "We can try, at least." "Yes," Takaku said. "We can try." The years that followed were not easy. There were setbacks and hardships, moments of despair and anger. But there were also moments of joy. Clara's first words, her first day at school, the first time she called Takaku father without prompting. There were quiet evenings by the fire, the three of them together, and loud gatherings when Takaku's relatives visited, filling the hybrid cabin with laughter and food and stories. And there was the night, 5 years after they first met, when Takaku and Josephine stood under the stars and spoke their own vows without benefit of clergy or legal recognition, simply promising to walk together for as long as they both lived. Clara, now 7 and solemn, held their hands and declared herself a witness, and that was enough. The town watched and whispered, as it always did. But the whispers were quieter now, less judgmental. Josephine and Takaku had earned their place through sheer endurance, through refusing to leave or hide or apologize. They had simply lived their lives with as much dignity as they could manage. And eventually the town had run out of energy for outrage. On a cold morning in late autumn, 10 years after the day Josephine had knelt in the snow outside Harmon's trading post, she stood at the window of their cabin and watched Clara, now 10 years old, helping Takaku prepare for a hunting trip. The girl was tall for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and quick hands comfortable in both calico and buckskin. "She's going to break hearts someday," Eliza Pike said from behind her. The school teacher had stopped by to drop off books, as she often did. "She's going to break conventions," Josephine corrected. "Hearts can take care of themselves." Eliza laughed. "Fair enough. How are you feeling about the move?" Josephine glanced back at the traveling trunks stacked in the corner. They were leaving Sorrow Hill, not fleeing, but choosing. Takaku's band was moving north to the reservation, and they were going with them. It was not ideal, but it was safer than staying in a town that still balanced on the edge of tolerance. "Nervous," Josephine admitted, "but also ready. We've done all we can here." "You've done more than most," Eliza said quietly. "You survived Hart. You exposed his crimes. You gave that child a chance at a life. That's not nothing. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But it's what we have." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Takaku and Clara through the window. Then Eliza squeezed Josephine's shoulder and left, promising to write. That night, their last in the cabin, Josephine lay awake listening to the familiar sounds, the wind in the eaves. Clara's soft breathing, Takaku's steady heartbeat beneath her ear. In the morning, they would leave everything familiar and venture into uncertainty once more. But they would do it together, as they had done everything since that first day in the snow. And that Josephine had learned was what mattered. Not the destination, but the company on the journey. She felt Takaku's hand find hers in the dark, felt his fingers lace through hers, and smiled. "Are you awake?" he whispered. "Yes." "Are you afraid?" "No," Josephine said and realized it was true. "Not anymore." "Good," Takaku said. "Neither am I." They fell asleep like that, hands joined, hearts aligned, facing whatever came next, with the hard-won confidence of people who had survived the worst and found each other on the other side. The storm that began the day Josephine knelt in the snow had finally passed. What remained was not perfection, not even close, but it was real and earned, and theirs, and that was enough.